We are getting some big names back from injury, which is really big for these rankings today as we're going through the top 16 quarterbacks and tight ends for Week 9 fantasy football. And I'm doing everything I can to get us ready for Week 9, so go down there, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now, get into our first tier of tight ends here we'll start out with. And I think that this tight end tier has to be really big in my opinion because I think that there's a bunch of guys that could finish as the tight end one in any particular week. In other words, basically, I think that these are our top performing tight ends on the season so far, and the matchups are all good. Trey McBride's at number 1, and Jake Ferguson is at number 2. So with Trey McBride, we have to think of this guy as obviously the lead target in Arizona's offense. He's kind of one of the lone tight ends that's actually the top target overall, not just tight end, top target on his entire team. Now, the one concern that I have, and I actually did highlight this in a couple live streams particularly, before I was doing these rankings on a weekly basis, that Trey McBride was better off with Jacoby Brissett than he is with Kyler Murray. Because Jacoby Brissett, he can target him over the middle of the field, and he can also target him in the red zone. Since Kyler's so short, he can't see over his line when he's at the red zone. So there is a very direct correlation between touchdown passes that Trey McBride catches and having a taller quarterback than it does with Kyler Murray. So that's my only problem, but obviously the matchup against Dallas is a really ideal one. And then Jake Ferguson in that same matchup, I'm actually picking to have a pretty big bounce back week. You know, I think the one issue that Ferguson had last week was that the Denver pass rush is so strong. It's the best pass rush in the league by literally 10 sacks over number 2 in the league. And the problem that they had was that they could not protect Dak. So a lot of times, instead of running routes last week, he was being dropped back into pass blocking. So he was doing a lot of pass blocking, not as much of the route running. Now, I will say, did worry about Ferguson with the return of CeeDee Lamb, but in that 1 week, the first week that CeeDee was back, he was still a really good tight end, particularly in the red zone. I think we kind of get back to that this week, and if he doesn't perform, then my long-term outlook on him will definitely change. Tyler Warren's at 3, and Brock Bowers is at 4, and Tyler Warren at Pittsburgh. You know, I think I just have a big, thing for Tyler Warren because he's so consistent on his work, but he also doesn't get that much. I think Brock Bowers in his return probably gets more targets than Tyler Warren does. But the thing with Tyler Warren that I think just makes me want to play him in a lot of situations is, first of all, his involvement in the offense is very stable, but it's not super high end. We're getting 7 to 8 targets on the high end with Tyler Warren and maybe a low end of 4 targets, but he's basically catching everything. And he has become a legitimate red zone threat as well. And also, they're playing the Pittsburgh Steelers' poorest pass defense. This one's going to work. And then Brock Bowers at 4 versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, also in his return to action, I think is immediately a top-tier target in this offense. Jacoby Myers clearly doesn't want to play for this team. Trey Tucker is a good wide receiver too in the NFL, I think, but not a number 1. And so Brock Bowers immediately, I think, comes back and is dominant in this offense as far as target share goes. Wouldn't shock me to see him get 10 targets in his return. And it's against a defense that I think can be beaten as well. So I'm good with playing Brock Bowers at 4. But there are players like I just named that I would play over him this week. Tucker Kraft is at 5 and Kittle is at 6 to round out this big tier right here. And Tucker Kraft, listen, I think that a couple things are at play in this particular matchup. So obviously Tucker Kraft, kind of someone I view similarly to Tyler Warren, where he actually does have lower weeks of target involvement. Sometimes he has 2 target games. And I think a lot of those games come in blowout type of situations. And this feels like it could be a blowout. So he's got this little window where he can maximize all of his work that he could possibly get. And I don't think it's going to be a game like Pittsburgh where they're going to throw into the fourth quarter. But then I also think it could be one of those games where Tucker Kraft just comes out and dominates. At this point, either way, he's become a really dominant player in Green Bay's offense on a weekly basis. And then George Kittle at number 6 to round out the tier. At the New York Giants, the matchup is obviously good, and Kittle has become a lot more involved in the offense in his second week back. So his third week back, I expect to be more the same of what we saw in week 2 from him. Dropping down to our next tier, I've got Oronde Gadsden at number 7 and Zach Ertz at 8. So I just realized I was pronouncing his name wrong. For like the first month of the season that he was starting to become relevant in fantasy, it's Gadsden, not Gadsden. But he is, I mean, he's the real deal. I will say, like, athletically, he reminds me a lot of a big wide receiver by the name of Dorial Green-Beckham. Shout out to those who know who that is, because he did nothing in the NFL, but he was dominant at the University of Mizzou. So Oronde Gadsden is just in an offense that obviously you want with Justin Herbert, and he's becoming a legitimate weekly threat. Now, there are going to be games where he does not do anything, and I don't know when to predict those types of outcomes, because last week against the Minnesota Vikings, who they handled, he was very important, particularly on the first drive. But I do think that Tennessee obviously is not going to be able to hold them for points for very long. So he does have a window, kind of like Tucker Kraft, but the way he's been playing, I want him in my lineup in most situations. Zach Ertz, number 8. His ranking on a weekly basis is directly tied with if Jayden Daniels plays or not. So Jayden Daniels expected to play on Sunday night versus the Seattle Seahawks. Not a great matchup, but Zach Ertz is one of his top targets. And especially without Terry McLaurin there, Zach Ertz is definitely a top 10 tight end because he is always a important target in Jayden Daniels' eyes. So that's the reason that his ranking every week is totally attached to Jayden Daniels' availability. Mark Andrews at 9 and Travis Kelce at 10. So Mark Andrews at Miami tonight, I think is going to be a really solid play. Like, I don't think I should say it like that because he's either going to hit or it's either going to be a disaster. Because his game logs, like since the past 2 years, have been just so volatile that it's like a disaster if he doesn't hit. But if he does hit, it makes a lot of sense because it's a high upside matchup. The over-under on this game is low-key awesome. It's like in the 50s. And I do see them putting up a bunch of points with Lamar back. And that's the key to the whole thing. If Lamar is there, I think that Mark Andrews is a good option. And then Travis Kelce. Obviously, I look like a dummy because I've been underselling Kelce all year long. Especially with the return of Rashee Rice, I did not expect him to continue to be this involved. But the reality is he has been a very critical piece to this offense. Even when he drops passes, Mahomes keeps going back to him because that trust is unbreakable. So in this high upside matchup at Buffalo, you'd be a fool, and particularly talking to myself, because I keep underranking him to not have him inside the top 10. Dalton Kincaid's at 11 to round out the tier in that same matchup. I get it. Last week in his return from injury and the bye week didn't do much. But I will say in this high upside matchup versus Kansas City, Josh Allen's going to throw to reliable targets. And he has become one. Like, he's caught the majority of its targets this year. They've had much better chemistry. It just kind of depends on a weekly basis how involved he is. Sort of a poor man's Tucker Kraft in some ways, but I do think in this matchup we could see an upside game from Dalton Kincaid.
Since this is such a high-scoring matchup, I actually think this is going to be a really interesting poll to post. So right now I'm going to go to fsroundup.com and go to Travis Kelce, type in Travis Kelce, and then go to chat, start a poll for Week 9, and I'm going to line him up with Dalton Kincaid, and I want you to vote on this poll right now. It's completely free to vote on this poll and also to post your own start sit poll because this one, I'm actually really curious what a lot of people would do in this particular matchup here. So again, post a poll for free, vote on a poll for free as well. And if you do want to get access to my weekly top 250 rankings, that is behind the premium subscription, which is now $6 a month. So we dropped it from $8.88 a month to $6 per month, really to make it more widely affordable for regardless of where you live in the world, whether you live here or in Timbuktu. We want you to be a part of FS Roundup and also get access to the automatic waiver wire tool, a league-winning feature that no other site can offer you. Also, the comparison feature and the league sync-up features, league-winning tools for just $6 a month. You need to get on this price today.
Dropping down to our next tier, Sam LaPorta and Kyle Pitts round out this short little tier right here. And I think the way I think about this one, when you see the next tier, these are guys that I think have higher upside than the following tier, but they don't have the same level of consistency and reliability in their offenses
as the guys in the tier above them. Like with LaPorta in particular, we can see games where he just doesn't do much. But we can also see games where they go kind of Sam LaPorta-centric in certain drives, where he could have a really good quarter or something like that. So versus Minnesota, the defense is pretty good, but they just won't be able to stop the Lions for long enough to not have their options do well. So just depends on game script on this one. And that's the same thing with Pitts. Pitts is questionable already. We don't know if he's going to go in this game. He was limited in practice yesterday. If he goes, obviously I think he's got upside. It proved it last week with Kirk Cousins, and he's proved it already with Michael Penix. I mean, this guy has become a central piece of the passing game. So at New England, in a game where I would imagine they'll be trailing, he'll be important to an extent, I would imagine. Dropping down to our last tier, Evan Ingram's at 14 and Hunter Henry's at 15. So again, you can see why LaPorta and Pitts were not in this tier, but they weren't in the tier above them because LaPorta and Pitts offer more upside than Ingram and Henry do. Unless Henry's getting in the end zone twice, he doesn't have the same amount of upside as those guys. And with Evan Ingram, this is a guy who actually does see a really consistent target share and should not be overlooked, particularly in PPR formats. But this guy is catch and drop. He will catch the ball and fall down. He's not getting yards after the catch. He needs to be in the end zone for him to have any touchdown upside whatsoever. And at Houston, the matchup is not particularly great, but I do think there's a chance he sees a good amount of target involvement because Sutton will be blanketed by Derek Stingley all game. And then again, Henry is completely dependent on if he gets in the end zone or not because the guy doesn't see enough targets on a weekly basis for him to be reliable. And then A.J. Barner to round out the whole thing at Washington. I do think A.J. Barner is one of those guys similar to Hunter Henry, but also is a good yards after catch type of guy. This guy is targeted deep and he is targeted in the end zone. So I think it's a good upside play. But I will say this, involvement and Elijah Arroyo's continued emergence continue to be a thorn in A.J. Barner's side. So I like him, I just don't like him enough to make him a really good tight end play this week. Now let's move on to the quarterbacks here. And the first tier of quarterbacks I think has massive upside this week. And Mahomes in this matchup versus Buffalo and Josh Allen at number 3. And then Lamar Jackson at number 2 tonight versus the Miami Dolphins. Mahomes at Buffalo. The way I look at this one, Mahomes versus Allen, is that I think Mahomes is in a better spot because Buffalo's defense isn't as good. And they're actively losing important pieces. So I don't think that there's much of a shot. Buffalo gets the punt unit against the Kansas City Chiefs more than once. Like, I think that Kansas City will move the ball at will in this game, and we know that it's going to be a competitive game. So it's going to be one of those like 35-42 type of victories that one of these teams will have. It just comes down to who gets more stops, and I think Kansas City's defense stops Allen more than Buffalo's defense stops Mahomes. So I've got Mahomes at 1. And then Lamar at 2. You know, obviously Lamar's upside, especially on a points per game basis, is stupid high. And I do think that at Miami, there's no chance they can stop him if he's fully healthy. That's my one concern is how healthy does he look, particularly when he's running the ball? Because, of course, that's a big part of Lamar's weekly upside in fantasy football. So I've got him at 2 just to kind of mitigate that one risk right there below Mahomes, who I think is going to play outstanding in this game. And then Allen. Again, I think obviously Allen is great. He belongs in tier 1 basically every single week he plays. But I will say, I do think Kansas City's defense comes up with one more stop than Buffalo does against Kansas City's offense. So I do think Allen probably has one drive or two where he has less of an impact from fantasy football than Mahomes does, and probably Lamar Jackson does as well. Dropping down to our next tier, Drake May is still a really good play versus the Arizona Cardinals, and I think Dak is a really good play and a bounce-back candidate in a big way this week. So with Drake May, obviously the guy in any game script has done very well. And there's really one main reason for this one. Their run offense is not good. Like, they do not have a consistent running threat at all. And even in last week's game versus Cleveland, where Travion Henderson took the ball 10 times for 75 yards, it wasn't enough to make them want to rely on the run consistently, even when they had built a lead. So Drake May, to me, is kind of matchup proof in that sense,
but I will say I don't think has the 30-point upside that the guys in tier 1 do. Dak Prescott, again, versus the Arizona Cardinals, I think it's a really good matchup for him to take advantage of. And Dak is in this unique spot to where he's going to have the opportunity for a bounce-back game, and I don't think Arizona's pass rush will be as dominant as Denver's. And that's been Dak's weakness this year. So he's been under duress, and then in times of duress and in times of trailing, that's when we can see Dak turn the ball over. They're not going to trail much at all, if at all, in this game. So I do think they'll build a lead, and Dak will be able to manage the game from there and give you good fantasy upside. Daniel Jones at 6, and Jayden Daniels is at 7 to round out this tier. Daniel Jones, the matchup is great, and the guy's realistically just been so consistent. You know, he doesn't have like a 30-point ceiling or anything like that, but I do think that this is one of those games where you can kind of combine his floor and his ceiling for a 25-point outcome in certain circumstances if everything hits well. So I don't think that he'll throw any picks, if at all. And I don't think that they'll be able to establish much of a pass rush because they haven't done that lately. And Indianapolis' offensive line is fantastic. And their offense as a whole is just running through people this year. So I think Daniel Jones against the Pittsburgh Steelers will have a field day. And then Jayden Daniels, I couldn't put him much higher than this. You know, the reality is that there's a couple of different factors at play here. Number one is that I think when you're constantly in and out of the lineup, it's a problem because you're not really establishing much chemistry. And I like Jayden Daniels a lot. Like, I'm a big Jayden Daniels guy, but he is still a year 2 quarterback. And this year has kind of been a lost season for him because he's been in and out of the lineup a lot. And that just creates problems with consistency. He's also losing his top weapon, Terry McLaurin, in this one, and Seattle's defense is already hard enough. So I do think he'll be fine from a fantasy perspective because he still can run. But I do think that he has a problem with upside in this matchup versus Seattle without his top weapon and against that good of a defense. Dropping down to our next tier, Caleb Williams is at 8 and Jackson Dart is at number 9. Now, I think that these two guys right here, these are projections, and if they don't hit, I will not continue to rank Justin Herbert in particular this low. But he's in the same tier. We'll get to him in a minute. I love Caleb this week. I think it's a massive bounce-back week, and it's against the Cincinnati Bengals. Like, that defense can't stop a nosebleed, and Caleb's been bad over the last several weeks, playing football in particular. His fantasy performances, they've been okay except for last week. So I do think Caleb can get back and have a good fantasy day today if he hits the ceiling, which I think is 25 to 30 points in this one. But obviously his floor is really low. And the funny thing is, I'm really not that big of a Caleb Williams fan, but I do think the upside in this matchup is pretty much undeniable. And then Jackson Dart versus San Francisco. When you're throwing guys like you and me out there on defense, any quarterback can do well. And Jackson Dart, to me, has proven himself in fantasy football. The guy runs on a weekly basis. He's got rushing upside. And I don't think that his weapons cast is obviously great without Malik Neighbors, and especially now without Cam Scatteraboo. But I do think that, again, when you throw guys like you and me, average Joes out there to play defense for you because you're losing a piece at least a week, there's a point of diminishing returns that you get to. And San Francisco hit that last week against the Texans defense with a quarterback who's not nearly as mobile. So I think Dart has a good game. Jordan Love's at 10, and again, Herbert is at 11. So Jordan Love, we could argue on this one for a long time. Jordan Love's upside is clearly high at this point. The return of Christian Watson has unlocked this offense, in my opinion, because they now have a true deep threat for Jordan Love to uncork it to. So against Carolina, I'm not debating that upside. What I am debating is the floor in this game, I think, is low. Because let's say that Josh Jacobs really just has one of his games, 2-3 touchdown type of games, and they don't need to throw that much. Well, that's going to limit the upside and the time that they'll be able to provide fantasy upside from a passing perspective if Carolina can't keep pace. And I have trouble believing Carolina will keep pace, so I think Love's floor this week is a little bit low. And same with Herbert. It's the game script problem as well. Like, this game script against Tennessee, they can have a big running day. I love Vidal this week, and I like their pass catchers every week because Herbert is great. But I do think Herbert, again, is in this position to where I think his upside is minimal because I think his floor is minimal because
they will be beating the crap out of the Titans so early that how likely is it that he's going to need to throw for very long? So I think that unless he gets the rushing upside he did last week, which was 62 yards, 6 points on the ground alone, it's not going to be the greatest floor day from Justin Herbert if he doesn't have to throw very long. Matt Stafford is at 12 to round out this tier versus the New Orleans Saints. I think that Stafford is a really good play this week. We just know that Matt Stafford's floor is pretty low. Like if this turns out to be a 21-3 type of matchup, then one of those is going to be a rushing touchdown, for example. Maybe one of those goes to Devontae Adams and the other one goes to Puka. That's just not that great of a day for throwing for 200 yards. So we just know Matt Stafford's not going to move around and get you rushing yards. Everything that he will get is attached to his arm in fantasy football. So his floor is just low, but the matchup upside I do think is awesome in this one. Dropping down to our last tier. I've got Kyler Murray actually one spot over Bo Nix, and I guarantee you people have been waiting for Bo Nix in these rankings, and people will be mad about my ranking of him. First of all, I like Kyler in his return at Dallas because the matchup is fantastic. And I get it, Kyler has not been good in fantasy this year. I understand that wholeheartedly. But the way I look at this is simply based on the fact that Kyler can move, and he has upside always. We just haven't seen it this year. And I do think in this matchup, that's where we could see the upside game. Bo Nix, on the other hand, at Houston, that's a problem. We've got a real problem in this one because Bo Nix is already inconsistent enough throwing the ball. And he also is not running that much. So Bo Nix's floor has been very low this year. In Houston, they proved last week against the 49ers, that's a tough place to go play. So I do worry about this matchup for Bo Nix in Houston because that defense is awesome. And that matchup in Houston, that's a game changer. So I don't love Bo this week. Joe Flacco and Aaron Rodgers are two 40-year-old studs at 15 and 16 to round us out. Flacco, again, is a 50-50 to play. As of the time of this filming, I don't know what his practice report looked like on Thursday. Maybe by the time you're watching this, you know if he practiced on Thursday or not. So Joe Flacco, if he plays, I think that he's just been slinging it this year. And I think that regardless of who he plays, and I think Chicago is beatable, he will be good in this game if he plays. Aaron Rodgers versus the Indianapolis Colts. Rodgers has been actually pretty good in fantasy as well, low-key. And it's a matchup they're going to have to keep up in. Like, this is a game where I think Rodgers has to throw for 3 touchdowns if the Steelers have any chance to win this game. So I expect him to sling the rock a lot because they'll be in an early deficit and they'll have to play catch up when they can't really run the ball to drain the clock. So let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below. And if you want to see the top 30 running back rankings for Week 9, click on this video right here.